Hey, Wasatch Stars, Mrs. Tanner again. I hope that you watched my last video because it got pretty funny. Just like so many of your parents, I am working from home and trying to do school at home with my kids and just keep things not so crazy. And last time I was reading, my kids jumped on the couch, which unplugged the Wi-Fi. And so if you were watching, all of a sudden the video just stops. It took me a little while to figure out what was going on. And it's also taken me a long time to find a quiet time when there are no kids or no dogs around. It's pretty tricky to do. So, but here I am. I'm gonna reread chapter 10. It's really short, but it got cut off last time. So I'm going to keep going with The Wild Robot by Peter Brown. And remember that this is in special thanks to Little Brown and Company for letting us read this. Chapter 10, The Reminder. I should remind you, reader, that Roz had no idea how she had come to be on that island. She didn't know that she'd been built in a factory and then stored in a warehouse before crossing the ocean on a cargo ship. She didn't know that a hurricane had sunk the ship and left her crate floating on the waves for days until finally it washed ashore. She didn't know that she'd been accidentally activated by those curious sea otters. And as the robot looked out at the island, it never even occurred to her that she might not belong there. As far as Roz knew, she was home. Chapter 11, The Robot Sleeps. Roz stood on the peak and watched the sun sink behind the ocean. She watched shadows slowly spread over the island and up the mountainside. She watched the stars come out, one by one, until the sky was filled with 1,000,000 points of light. It was the first night of Roz's life. She activated her headlights, and then suddenly the bright shafts of light were beaming out from her eyes and illuminating the whole mountaintop. Too bright, so she dimmed them. Then she turned them off and sat in darkness and listened to the chorus of nighttime chirps. After a while, our robot's computer brain decided it was a good time to conserve energy. Conserve means save. So she sat and anchored her hands to the rocks. Her non-essential programs switched off. Non-essential means they're not needed right at that moment. And then, in her own way, the robot slept, right? She's not going to sleep like a human does, but she's kind of powered down a little bit. Chapter 12. Oh, yeah, the storm. Look at that. Roz felt safe up on her mountaintop, so she spent the next few days and nights perched on the peak. But everything changed one afternoon when a low flying cloud crept up the mountain and Roz found herself surrounded by white. Have you ever seen that when you drive up into the mountains and you're in a cloud? It's pretty magical. When the world faded back into view, she noticed more clouds floating south past the island. Then she heard a deep rumble behind her. What's the rumble? It's probably thunder, right? The robot turned her head around and saw that the sky was filled with a swirling wall of darkness. Light flickered here and there, and more deep rumbles. A storm was approaching, and it wasn't just any storm. It was as fierce as the one that had sent the cargo ship to the ocean floor. The wind picked up, and the first drops of rain tapped against the robot. It was time to go. Roz unclamped her hands and began sliding down the peak. Hot sparks flew from where her body scraped against the leaning slab of stone. As soon as her feet hit soil, she was off and running. The rain fell harder, the wind blew faster, the lightning flashed brighter, the thunder cracked louder. So much rainwater was falling that rushing rivers of runoff started springing up everywhere. Roz splashed down the mountain, searching through the gloom for any kind of shelter. But she should have watched where she was going. Her heavy feet slipped and tripped, and she tumbled right into a mudslide. Our robot was helpless. The river of mud whisked her downhill, slamming her into rocks and dragging her through bushes and sweeping her straight toward a cliff. Mud was pouring off the cliff like a waterfall. Roz frantically clawed at the ground, grasping for anything she could hold on to, but the flow only carried her faster toward the edge. And just as she was about to plunge over the side, she came to a hard, sudden stop. Mud surged around her, spraying into her face and pinning her against some solid thing. She blindly felt with her hands and recognized the thick roots of a trunk of a pine tree. In an instant, she was pulling herself up on the branches. The wind whipped across the mountainside, and Roz heard a familiar thunk of pine cones pelting her body. But she didn't mind them, right? They're not such a big deal now, right? She was just happy to be safe from the mud flow. The robot locked her arms and legs around the tree and waited for the storm to blow over. Chapter 13, The Aftermath. Daybreak and the storm had passed, but the sounds of water were everywhere. The air was filled with the dripping sounds of mountain runoff and the sloshing sounds of flooded streams. And then came a very different sound. It was the clanging sound made when a robot slips on a wet rock. There were quite a few changes that morning. As Roz worked her way downhill, she scanned the aftermath of the storm. Giant mounds of mud and debris had formed below the cliffs. The island's central river had crested its bank. Crested means it's coming up to the edge of where the land is, and so the water in the river is about to spill over onto the land. It's no longer down in the river. Let's see here. And spilled into nearby fields and forests. Some trees had been uprooted. Others were submerged, so some are pulled out and some are covered in water. Their branches barely poking up above the floodwaters. Their lower branches swarming with fish instead of birds. After such a storm, you might expect to see animal corpses scattered among the devastation. But the animals seemed to have survived just fine. Somehow, they had known that the storm was coming, and they had found shelter long before it rolled in. Animals are pretty smart that way. Lowland creatures who had sought refuge on higher ground were waiting patiently for the water to recede. Deer were wading through the flooded fields. Beavers were busily collecting a trove of fallen branches. Geese honked in the sky before splashing down into a watery section of the forest. Clearly, the animals were experts at survival. Clearly, the robot was not. Roz was crusted with mud and grit, so she gave herself another good cleaning, but that only revealed her dents and scratches. They were really starting to add up. She hardly resembled the perfect robot who had appeared on the shore just a week earlier. The wilderness was taking a toll on poor Roz, so she felt something like relief when she spotted a quiet hole in the side of the mountain. It looked like a safe place for a robot. She stomped across the hillside up to the cave, but never stopped to wonder what might be lurking within. Right? A robot doesn't know, maybe a cave is not such a good place for me to go. We'll read one more chapter and then we'll be done for today, but here's your clue. I bet you predicted. Chapter 14, The Bears. Roz stomped into the cave, and then she stomped right back out. "Please stay away," said the robot to two bears who were now nipping at her heels. You see, when Roz stomped into the cave, she accidentally woke a brother and sister bear from their morning nap, which is never a good idea. And to make matters worse, bears have an instinct that drives them to attack when a creature runs away, especially if the creature running away is a mysterious sparkling monster. So, as the startled bears watched Roz stomping out of their cave, they really had no choice at all. They simply had to take up the chase. Roz tried her best to outrun the bears. She leaped over rocks and wove through trees and stomped across the mountainside at full speed, but the bears were young and fast and strong, and the robot still had so much to learn about moving through the wilderness. She never even saw the tree root. One moment she was stomping along, and the next moment she was flying through the air and thumping down onto a rotten log. Clumps of soft wood stuck to her side as she stood and faced her attackers. Wouldn't you be afraid if 2 bears were charging toward you? Of course you would. Everyone would. Even the robot felt something like fear. Roz was programmed to take care of herself. She was programmed to stay alive. And as the robot watched those bears charging toward her, she knew her life was in serious danger. The bears slammed into Roz, knocking her against the trunk of a towering tree. Then one bear dove at her legs and the other clawed at her chest. If only the robot had swung her fists or kicked her feet, she could have scared them off. But one good bop in the nose would have sent them running. But the robot's programming would not allow her to be violent. Clearly, Roz was not designed to fight bears. Powerful jaws chomped on her arms. Sharp claws slashed her face. A massive head rammed her chest. Please stay away, said the robot. Roar, said Sister Bear. Grrr, said Brother Bear. And then the bears went in for the kill. But the robot had vanished. I wonder where she went. Chapter 15 is called The Escape. We will keep reading next time, but I want you to think in your mind, where could she have gone? My friends, it is April, which means it's school library month. So we'll be talking a lot about books and other things that are special to us. And I hope that we can do some special activities this month. Thinking about you all, missing you so much. And tune in next time and we'll see where Roz went.